This is an Irreverent podcast. Check out irreverent.fm for shows from all our friends.
Hello and welcome back to Exvangelical, a show exploring the world inside and outside the evangelical subculture. I'm your host, Blake Chastain. Today's show is our first re-release of a conversation I've had previously, and it's my conversation with Greg Coates from episode 3. Greg Coates is a scholar whose work focuses on political theology, as well as the author of the book Politics Strangely Warmed, Political Theology in the Wesleyan Spirit. But before we get back to that, let me make some announcements first. Starting next week, our newsletter, The Exvangelical Reader, will launch. The Exvangelical Reader will provide expanded show notes, links to books, music, and whatever else may be mentioned on the show, as well as a curated list of articles from around the web that I think are interesting and worth sharing with you. It'll be the type of email that you're happy to receive. A link to sign up is in the show notes. If you haven't already, please consider supporting the show via Patreon. Patreon is a wonderful platform that allows you to support the work of Exvangelical directly each month. I'm continuing to work out the awards for various levels of support, and I do want to thank the following patrons: Stephen, Kyle, Diane, and Patrick. Please rate and review the show on iTunes if you haven't, and follow the show across social media at facebook.com/exvangelicalpod and on Twitter and Instagram at exvangelicalpod. You can follow me directly on Twitter at brchastain. Now, with Thanksgiving coming up and some potentially awkward conversations in your future, I thought this conversation with Greg was more important and relevant than ever. He really dives into a lot of the history of political theology specific to American evangelicalism, the sorts of cultural norms that it created, as well as his experience in other cultures and ways that his own experience and study has sort of broadened his understanding. We do kvetch a little bit about Trump, and this was actually before his election. So it's an interesting insight into the sorts of processing that a lot of people that may listen to this show have gone through. So without further ado, let's get back into it. I hope this is relevant for those who may have joined the show later on. This was originally episode 3, as I mentioned before, but I'm happy to share it with you again. All right, have a good one.
Hi everybody and welcome back to Exvangelical. We've got a great guest today by the name of Greg Coates. Greg is a PhD candidate in historical theology as well as the author of the book Politics Strangely Warmed, Political Theology in the Wesleyan Spirit. We talk about his evangelical youth, his journey to China, his time as a pastor in the inner city, and we also critique conservative evangelicalism's dalliances with the Republican Party since the 1970s. It's a very good conversation, covers a lot of topics, and is about an hour and a half long, but it is a wonderful discussion, and I can't wait to share it with you. All right, now let's get into this conversation. Thanks very much. Hi, welcome to Exvangelical. I have with me this week Greg Coates. He is a PhD candidate at Garrett Evangelical Theological Seminary, father of 2. And we're going to talk a little bit about his experience and where he is now. So, welcome, Greg.
Thank you so much, Blake. It's great to be here.
Thank you. So, let's talk a little bit about. Let's just start at the beginning. Where did you grow up?
Yeah, well, like is common among a lot of evangelicals. I grew up in a very religious home, very devout. My father is a pastor in the Methodist Church, which is one of the holiness denominations, and both my father and mother are very committed, serious-minded Christians who shaped me in my faith from when I was very young. There was never a time I can recall that I didn't know about Jesus because, I was read the storybooks from from before I could talk. So I was it was kind of in the air that I breathed growing up. I'm very thankful for my heritage because without it, I wouldn't be where I am today. My pilgrimage has taken me to different places, but I still have deep respect for my parents, even if I disagree with them on some things. So growing up as a pastor's kid, I was kind of a leader in my youth group. and I was into Bible quizzing, which is a big thing in our little denomination. So by the time I graduated from high school, I had actually at one point or another memorized about 2/3 of the New Testament, from the from the 7 different years that I'd spent in the quizzing program. Um, and at about 18, as it's common for that age, I just thought I had it all figured out. I had all the answers. And I went to college kind of with that attitude. I had been warned about these liberal professors that were down there. I went to Greenville College in Illinois. And I went there armed to do battle. I had books at my side. I even attended, in the summer before I went to college, attended a seminar in Colorado. Um, it was led by a guy named Dr. Alan Noble. I believe that was his name. And I know it's Noble. And it's called Summit Ministries in Colorado. It's basically um, a very fundamentalist, conservative, right-wing, hyper-Calvinist boot camp where they kind of indoctrinate you with apologetic arguments to use against your secular liberal acquaintances. We even went out and tried to convert people on the last day, where we were trained in kind of like an evangelism explosion sort of method, where we would ask people if they were willing to participate in a survey, and through kind of a hook like that, we would try to get them to pray the sinner's prayer.
Gotcha. Was that
Yeah.
what part of Colorado was that in?
It's in Colorado Springs. I'm not sure if it's still going or not, but it wouldn't surprise me if it is. It was thriving at the time that I went, and this would have been the summer of 1999, I believe. And it I mean, the people that I met there were good people. They were very genuine. But it's kind of represents to me the pinnacle of a subculture that I was utterly immersed in without even being aware of it. It's like um, a fish isn't aware of the water that they swim in, and I wasn't aware of um, the very particular nature of the evangelical culture that I was raised in. And it's not really until you step out of it that you can kind of see it more clearly for what it is, I think.
So can you explain a little bit about anything in particular to the Free Methodist tradition? I grew up going to United Methodist churches. So I went to one in rural central Indiana. So like within the church, there is a pretty big I would say like rural urban divide. But
Right.
but there was definitely a lot. I mean, there was conservatism. I mean, we had like we definitely had like women pastors present, and that was very much within the Methodist tradition. But if you went to Chicago, downtown Chicago Church, it'd be a very different experience, even back in the 80s and 90s when I was growing up.
Absolutely. We used to joke that the Free Methodist Church is about as free as the United Methodist Church is united. So,
gotcha.
Yeah, it's
so it has a shared Wesleyan heritage, but there are a number of divisions within that particular history, right?
Yeah. So you're right. We share the same kind of theological roots, going back to the original Methodist movement with John Wesley in the 18th century in England, and then the emergence of American Methodism in the late 18th century and early 19th century in America. So in a nutshell, what happened was that Christianity in America has always dealt with this tension between sort of a movement on the margins among people who are poor. At the time, it was a movement among slaves and women and the uneducated, and largely people who were lower middle class or lower class. And that is part of what gave the movement its vitality. Methodism, by the year 1820, had become the largest Protestant body in the United States, which was quite remarkable considering that it was only about 1,000 people at the dawn of the Revolutionary War. And so it had experienced this incredible explosive growth. And largely it was because it tapped into this kind of egalitarian political spirit, what we call Jeffersonian republicanism, this idea that we can be independent and self-sufficient, and the theology of the Methodists fit with that really well. We can have it taught that through our own free choices, we can come in contact with God, that we don't need some kind of mediator or priest to intercede for us, but that we ourselves can have experiences with God. And so Methodism, as it grew, eventually became kind of culturally respectable. It built large churches in the cities. The wealthy began to be converted to it and donate significant sums of money to it. And so the Free Methodist Church grew out from the mid-19th century, when a number of people were unhappy with the turn toward respectability and wealth. They saw it as an abandonment of original Methodism and of original Wesleyanism. They saw it as theologically inconsistent and believed basically that a lot of Methodists were compromising way too much on their theology and on their social witness in order to appeal to people with power and to become culturally respectable. So a movement grew up really from the 1820s and forward. Actually, you can trace it back to the Cane Ridge Revival, I believe it was in 1802. And there were a number of people who said, this isn't who we are. We need to recapture our original vision for holiness. And it became what's called the Holiness Movement, an attempt to recapture Wesley's teachings on entire sanctification, and also to demand that it become once again a church among the poor. The sort of respectable Methodists didn't like this, and in the case of my own denomination, the Free Methodist Church, the founder B.T. Roberts had written some scathing articles rather in a popular Methodist periodical, and the powers that be didn't like it, and they kicked him out of the church. And so that's how the Free Methodist Church was born. It was out of the holiness tradition. And when we say the holiness tradition, we talk about not only the Free Methodist, but the Wesleyan Church and the Nazarene Church. Those are, in particular, the three major players, although you can also argue that even modern-day Pentecostalism actually comes from the holiness tradition as well.
Interesting. I guess we should disclose here that Greg is actually a Free Methodist scholar. So a lot of this information that he's dropping is courtesy of the fact that he has spent several years studying his denomination's history and is probably not just innate knowledge from being a PK.
Right. Yeah, thanks for that clarification. I probably got some deep waters there. I was trying to do it in a nutshell. It's dangerous to ask a PhD student about the topic.
No, that's definitely. I mean, I definitely want to loop back to a number of things you mentioned. The original movement started by John Wesley was in many ways very socially conscious. And then you also have this Free Methodist movement that is also very socially conscious, and that is within the history of those denominations at their origins. What was it like in the 80s and 90s when you were growing up? Was that sort of teaching still present? I mean, was that sort of either mode of thinking or anything like that still present within the denomination, or had it kind of subsided into this sort of generalized evangelicalism that honestly a lot of people can identify with.
Right, right. And I mean, it's a great question. You can find vestiges of this interest in social reform within modern day evangelicalism. So, for example, it's not apolitical. Evangelicals are people who vote and they organize and they try to get their candidate into office. And, um, generally speaking, you have evangelicals supporting Mike Pence, for example, because he too has had this kind of conversion experience. So he's one of us. And we need to get our man into office or our woman into office in Washington so that we can preserve our values. That is all kind of the residual um, effect of the original 19th century impetus to create a Christian America, to create a sanctified society. Um, but the problem is that it's only on particular issues. Um, the so the evangelicals might be very passionate about picketing against abortion or trying to legislate against abortion, for example. But um, say when George Bush vetoed a bill that would have provided health care to children 5 and under, um, evangelicals didn't lift a finger about that because that was not on their radar, you see. So what happened was it became kind of partisan, and evangelicals in the 70s and 80s, and my church is included in this, became enamored with the religious right and the moral majority, and so that meant focusing on particular issues that fit within the conservative Republican paradigm, and neglecting those issues that might be quote unquote liberal issues, social justice issues. And so, growing up in the Free Methodist Church, they were people who were very pious and very intensely committed to their faith, but social justice was not a great emphasis on the radar. And that, I think, is precisely what happens when the church gets in bed with a political party. They begin to kind of corrupt their understanding of the faith and they make compromises. Um, so, yeah, I hope that kind of gets at your question.
Yeah, it absolutely does. Let's get back a little bit to where you started just a few minutes ago, which was you were also talking a bit about your experience at you said Greenville College. Is that right?
That's right.
And then so you went to this you went to a boot camp to refute secular professors and everything like that. Was Greenville did it have any affiliation? Is it a state school? Or I'm not familiar. I mean, it's downstate Illinois, right? Downstate being anywhere right outside of Chicago.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's about 45 miles east of St. Louis, in Illinois. It is actually a Free Methodist college. It was founded in 1892 by Free Methodists and maintains its affiliation with the Free Methodist Church. However, it has something of a reputation among a lot of pastors in the Free Methodist Church as being kind of a liberal college. And I was warned about this going there, and so entered the college, armed for battle and ready to defend the conservative evangelicalism I had grown up with, rather than to go there to learn and to listen and to be corrected or to receive an education, basically.
So how did that sit with you when you were in college? I mean, did you have your guard up all the time, or over time did that begin to lessen? What was your experience there?
I can point to the day when things changed for me, because for the first 2 years, my freshman and sophomore year, I really developed a reputation for being kind of militant and being an angry evangelical. I would often argue with professors and stand up and publicly denounced their teaching as unbiblical. I saw myself as being a soldier for a very righteous cause, and saw these professors as the enemy. Um, then in January of my junior year, I was actually in a class. Um, um, well, it's not important what class it was, but a professor came to me and she just simply said, "Greg, where is the love? Are we just wrong about everything? Do you have nothing to learn from us? And if you have nothing to learn from us, why do you pay thousands of dollars to come to this college? Um, and why do you have to be so angry with us all the time?" And it was a really kind of a harsh rebuke, and yet it was exactly what I needed to hear. Um, because I had been way too dogmatic and way too militant and angry. And I knew that this professor wasn't saying it because she hated me. She was saying it because she loved me. And um, it was kind of my conversion experience, if you will, where I left that room with my heart was heavy because I didn't like the fact that I had a reputation for being militant. I wanted to be known as a person of love and of compassion, and yet this reputation I built for myself, I fully deserved it. Um, so I even spent time in prayer and shed a few tears. And I made a decision that I would just keep my mouth shut for the next year. That in classes, I wouldn't be the one standing up challenging things. I would just shut up and listen. And that next year was a transformative time. Well, these things happen gradually, but I look back to that moment as a turning point where I began to open my mind to new perspectives and to question whether or not, in fact, I did have all the answers. Um, and for somebody who's really, and this is the problem with a lot of conservative evangelicalism, is it doesn't leave room for questions, it doesn't leave space for alternative points of view because it is a kind of an enclosed system. Um, and if you remove one brick from the fundamentals, then the fear is the whole building will collapse. And once finally submitted myself and was willing to listen, then the process of deconstruction, the holy deconstruction, um, could begin to take place.
Hmm. Wow, that's I mean, that is a very attuned teacher, I think, to kind of recognize that in a student and be able to tell them in such a way that they'll be able to receive. You know, that wasn't a simple thing for them to tell you.
No, not at all. But I'm so thankful for it. And to this day, I want the reason that I'm pursuing this degree to become a college professor at a school like Greenville or Indiana Wesleyan or whatever is because of the transformative experience that those professors had in my life. I owe a lot to them, and I'm very thankful for their work.
So after Greenville, you continued your study. Did you go directly to seminary, or did you take any sort of time off for work, or was it directly to grad school?
I did take some time off. I graduated a little early, and um, my wife Courtney and I graduated we married very young while we were in college. So I worked to put her through her last year of college, and I worked with a young boy who had cerebral palsy in the public school system, caring for him. And then we took a year to go to China and to teach English. We didn't have children yet, and I wanted to have a kind of cross-cultural encounter, and this was a deep way of doing it. Um, and probably more than any other year in my life, that year of living abroad, living as a minority among as an alien in exile, so to speak, was really transformative for me. I started to question lots of things about conservatism and particularly about patriotism and nationalism and militarism. This was right when the Iraq War was starting, and the entire world was appalled by the unilateral actions of George Bush. And it was I often say that George Bush made me a liberal because his war and his politics I found so abhorrent as a Christian that it made me start to critically think about this kind of alliance, this unholy alliance between evangelicals and the Republican Party.
I actually that I have a very similar narrative when it comes to the Bush era policy and becoming much more aligned to the left politically. One of my very first days of college, I think it was the first full week of class. Like we tended to start the Tuesday after Labor Day, and then the first full week of class, that Tuesday was September 11th.
Oh, wow.
So immediately, there was all this talk, and then all of a sudden the campus was overrun with talk about the possibility of war and everything else. And then over the next ensuing couple of years, it just became even more clear that there was this terrible conflation between conservatism and the Christianity that was being espoused, especially within the social sciences department I was a part of. It absolutely made me a more liberal person. Just thinking through those things personally and coming to the conclusions that was not within the alignment of what I understood to be a Christian witness, or whatever sort of language you want to assign to it, whether it's any sort of Christian interpretation of the world. It didn't seem to support that action.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. So I am right on course with you there, at least in parallel.
I think there's probably a whole generation of people that are of evangelicals or ex-evangelicals who are in that same situation, because what the Bush administration did was reveal to us how compromised the church had become by aligning itself with the Republican Party in order to get Bush elected. I mean, without evangelicals, it's obvious Bush wouldn't have been elected either the first or the second time. And so, he was our man. He's this devout, converted evangelical United Methodist from Texas. He's one of us. And here he is, indiscriminately having people killed on the other side of the world. And that disconnect between the message of Jesus, to love our neighbor and pray for those who persecute us, the juxtaposition there, I think, caused a lot of disequilibration, a lot of trouble in the minds of a whole bunch of evangelicals, especially young ones in their 20s who are trying to think through their faith. It was around this time I had a professor say, "I'm not exactly sure what Christ meant when he said, 'Love your enemies,' but I don't think he meant to bomb the hell out of them." And, that hit me, and I thought he's right. So anyway, your story, my story. I think we're part of an entire generation that has been impacted by these historical events.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And what was it like to be an American overseas during that time? I mean, you mentioned that the world was appalled, but like within your locality where you were in China, were people just confused? What was their reaction to you as an American? What was their reaction to America in general?
Right. Well, my students, because I was an American and they didn't know very many of them, they all wanted to talk about Bush and about the Iraq War and about politics in America. And of course, I love politics anyway and was very happy to talk about it. But whenever any of them would ask me, "Are you for the war or not?" I would be so conflicted. I didn't know what to say. I was raised a Republican, and yet I had these feelings that I'm not behind this war. This isn't a just war, even by Christian just war theory standards. This doesn't even meet that criteria. This is a crusade. Um, so it caused me to kind of think much more critically about my positions and also being aware of the fact that I was there as a Christian. Everybody knew I was a Christian. And so the stance that I take and the things that I say are representing to a large group of Chinese people what an American Christian is. And ultimately, I just decided I don't want to convey to them that Christians are militants, that Christians are warriors. Um, and so my conviction that the war was wrong-headed deepened my resolve to speak out against it, and I did so among the Chinese. It was both a crisis for me politically and theologically. Um, and theologically, it was a crisis just simply being around so many people that I loved, came to love so deeply, um, none of whom were Christians, and thinking, so do I believe all these people are going to hell? And unless I convert them, are they not going to be in heaven with me? I mean, so the theological crisis began to form as well. And I believe that's a holy moment in anyone's journey when we come face to face with the other, with someone who is different, radically different uh, in culture and language and religion and ethnicity and all this. It's a holy moment because it forces us to ask ourselves, what do I believe about God? What do I believe about these people? Um, and do I harbor beliefs in my heart that are inhuman? Um, so, yeah, I'm a big fan of the encounter with the other as a conversion moment because it was for me.
Hmm. So that was you spent a year doing that, and was it on mainland China? Was it in?
Yes, it was in mainland China in a city called Tianjin, which is in the far north. Its old name in the English pinyin is Tientsin, but it's a port city, city of about 9 million people that nobody's ever heard of, between Beijing and the coast.
And then from your year there, you then came back to the States, and you went to Asbury Seminary,
That's right.
which is a Methodist seminary, which has more evangelical leanings than others.
Correct.
What sort of questions did you bring to seminary from that experience? You had these questions about this experience with the other. How did that influence your time in seminary?
Right. I mean, I'm so I'm so thankful for that year in China before seminary because it did form a lot of very pressing questions, very practical questions in my mind about what it is we do as Christians. What is the mission of God in the world, and how do I fit into that? Because one thing I was convinced of is that it's not my job to form miniature white American evangelicals all across the world. um, it's not my job to make clones of myself. And yet, that is kind of what I've been taught that evangelism is, right? That it's making them one of us. And so that was kind of the primary driving question going into it is, what is this whole thing called church doing? Because do we really want to make all the Southeast Asian, the African, and the Chinese, and the South American, all these people groups into um, SUV driving, gun toting, mall shopping American consumers? I don't think so. Uh, right? And so, are we exporting our culture, or are we exporting Christ? I think that's a really important question to ask. So, those were all kind of in the back of my mind as I entered into seminary. Even questions of economics, like is capitalism something that should be tied to? Should we assume that capitalism is God's has God's blessing, as opposed to communism and these sorts of things, or socialism or other forms of government? All of those were juggling in my mind as I started to for 3 years dive deep into church history and theology, um, and it was. I'm thankful that those questions were there, because it made a much more vital experience, important experience. And I would add that it was in my third year at seminary that Jim Wallace from Sojourners came and gave a speech in our chapel. My wife Courtney was able to attend that chapel with me, and at the time we didn't know what we were going to do after seminary. I was in my final semester, and yet didn't have a clear sense of where we were going next. And in that chapel where Jim Wallace spoke, he gave a very simple message about the Christian's calling to the poor that was so profoundly moving to me and my wife. We ended the service in tears, and I became convinced at that point that God was calling me to pastor a church in some inner city poor neighborhood, and that's what led us into the next chapter of our lives.
And where was that? Where was that where did that next chapter take place?
Yeah, we ended up taking a church in Indianapolis, in the inner city, on the Near East side of Indianapolis. It's it's the zip code with the highest level of foreclosures in the state, the highest illiteracy rate in the state, the highest crime rates in the state. It was a very challenging place to be, and those were the dark years of my life, in a way, the years that I bumped up into my own limitations, realized that I cannot save the world, that there are problems far bigger than myself. I look back on the 27-year-old who entered into the ministry and shake my head at how idealistic I was, and how certain I was that I was going to transform the neighborhood I'd been assigned to live in, and to minister in. And wish that I could tell him to take it down a few notches and not get a big head and not believe that it's all about you. But I learned the hard way through the hard knocks of ministry. Um, and in some ways, I'm still dealing with the repercussions of those years.
What was the environment like there in Indianapolis? I think a lot of people have a very vague idea of what Indianapolis is outside of the cults and driving through to get somewhere else.
So the Near East side of Indianapolis, although that probably doesn't mean a lot to many people, you could think of the south side of Chicago or the Bronx in New York City, although of course not to quite the same scale. But really all the major northern cities, Philadelphia, New York and Boston and so on, have inherited the history of Black migration post-Civil War, and then throughout the 20th century, Blacks seeking to build a new life from the South. And there's a legacy. I mean, I won't go into it all, but the redlining and the districts and the political maneuvers to keep Blacks disenfranchised in northern cities Indianapolis is yet just another one of these stories, along with Detroit and Chicago and all the rest. Um, it's So, the neighborhood that we moved into was everything that you've come to associate with inner city. There were gunshots at night, drug needles in our yard, um, gangs and graffiti and uh, fights on the streets. It was a very challenging place to be for this white boy from middle class America. And yet, I felt I felt very firmly that that's where God wanted us to be. And so I moved my family and my young daughter there. My second daughter was born while we were there in Indianapolis on the Near East Side. And uh, yeah, I wrestled a great deal with that sense of calling and the difficulty of my life there as the pastor of a small flock of about 75 people who were trying to be a witness and a light in the midst of a very dark place. And I'll share one brief story. I became friends with one of the former pastors at First Free Methodist Church in Indianapolis, and I asked him, as the father of a daughter, how he felt safe being there in Indianapolis. And Bill looked at me and he said something I will never forget. He said, I'm not so sure that as Christians we're called to be safe. If, after all, we follow a man who got himself killed. And it wasn't the answer that I wanted to hear. I wanted to be reassured about the safety of the neighborhood and all that. But it was the answer that I needed to hear. And, how very far away I was from the comfortable half-country club churches of the suburbs. All of a sudden, my faith became very real and very dangerous and very uncomfortable.
Were there things that were specific to wrestling with some of the more evangelical sort of baggage or history that you might have had, or was it just the very nature of the circumstances you were in that that made it such a formative and difficult time? And if that's too personal, then we could move on. But
oh no, it's fine. I think it's a great question. I'm just trying to think of how best to answer it, because it was it was a complex time and a time where a lot was going on in my life. I was there from 2008 until 2012, and each day was difficult. um, it's in pastoral ministry that theology becomes real and the rubber meets the road. And pastors to this day are my heroes because they really have the hardest jobs in the world. In no other profession do we expect somebody to be so good at so many different things and then pay them so little to do it. The burnout rates, the dropout rates are astronomical. And so, I would have, and this was not just a typical pastorate, this was inner city. So I had people, coming up and saying, would you pray for me? I've been sexually molested this week, and I don't know whether I should leave the house or try to stay there. And if I do leave the house, I think I'll be homeless. This kind of raw, very real stuff isn't all, I mean, sometimes it's dealt with in the suburbs, but there's a pretty steady stream of that in the inner city. And made me realize how salvation has to be holistic. It can't just simply be some kind of spiritual, a moment of prayer where there's a change of status between you and God, and then you just go back to your life. It really has, salvation, if it is anything, has to be about this life. It has to be transformative. It has to offer hope for the here and now as well as for the future. And I'm not dismissing future hope by saying that. But salvation must involve the healing of relationships, the healing of families, finding a job, learning how to take care of your own body, um, dealing with trauma from the past, dealing with violence. Uh, that's salvation deals with all of these things. I grew up in a tradition that this may sound too harsh, but it was hyper spiritualized. It was a hyper spiritualized gospel. Everything about salvation was inside your mind and inside your heart, and it was between you and God. The inner city taught me that salvation is an outward and a physical reality. At least it ought to be, as much as an inward reality. And to separate those two from one another does violence to the gospel message. It's a way of raping the message of Jesus and contorting it into something of our own ends, making it something of our own ends. I think some people are very genuine. Some evangelicals are very genuine in their understanding of the gospel. And that's why I think the church has failed tremendously in its leadership and in its education to pass on a message to lay people and then to clergy that the gospel is just simply a get out of hell free card that you can keep in your back pocket until you die. That's a big answer to your question, but trying to get at some of the things that I learned while I was there.
I think it's a great response, and it actually parlays well into what happens next for you. I mean, your pastorate ends
right
at some you said I believe in 2012, and then you go on to continue your studies first at Duke and
right.
and then at Garrett Evangelical, and you have since you published I believe your master's thesis. Is that right?
That's correct. Yeah, what I worked on at Duke as a Master of Theology. Mm-hmm.
And that book is very concerned with political theology, is the term you use, and in particular the formation of a Wesleyan understanding of political theology. So your book is Politics Strangely Warmed, which is about understanding the political theology of the Wesleyan heritage or the Wesleyan tradition. But from the first part of your story here, it sounds like a clear continuation of the sorts of questions that you struggled with mentally and just personally, as well as actually saw face to face, both in your experience in China and being a minority and everything related to that, as well as your time leading a church in an inner city. So this whole experience, this whole history you have, has been sort of engaging a more socially aware side of the Christian, and specifically the American Christian experience, which is really very different than the more commonly known conservative evangelical tradition or politics. So you studied late 18th century, 19th century Wesleyan activists would be a modern word for them. What would you say there is for contemporary Christians or contemporary evangelicals or people who've left evangelicalism for any number of reasons? What do you think there is for those people to learn from those historical predecessors?
Yeah. The book, I wrote the book driven by a concern to sort of recapture what evangelicalism actually is, because it's become something other than what it began as. Perhaps the most formative book in my own theological education is Donald Dayton's Discovering an Evangelical Heritage. Um, and this book is a bit like that, except with focus on John Wesley and B.T. Roberts, the founder of the Methodist movement and Free Methodist movement, respectively. Um, in a nutshell, what I hope people gain from this book is that uh, for Wesleyans, the gospel is profoundly holistic. It engages not only the individual and the spiritual and the inward, but also the social and the political and the outward, the physical. And that means that salvation involves, for Zacchaeus, for example, in the Gospel of Luke, um, Jesus doesn't say salvation has come to this household until after Zacchaeus has publicly declared that he will pay back anything that he has stolen from people multiple times over. So, in other words, it's a physical and outward reality for Zacchaeus, and that's what salvation is in that story. Wesley, Roberts, those who lived prior to the 20th century understood that salvation compels the Christian to outward action and to seeking social justice. It really wasn't until the 1910s and 20s when we have dispensationalism and premillennialism and a reaction against evolution in the Scopes monkey trial that you get this kind of split between the fundamentalists and the modernists. So that may be kind of academic, but I think it's really important for us to understand, and this is kind of what my book is concerned with, that we have to understand that this divorce between social action and personal piety was never meant to be. And I think that, our generation and younger are getting that. They see the divorce for what it is, that it has created false idols, and caring for the poor is not a liberal thing to do. It's a Christian thing to do. So in my own small way, I wanted to contribute to that conversation and inspire people to understand how to do politics, how to engage in society as Christians, and in this case, particularly as Wesleyan Christians.
And following up on your recent comment there about caring for the poor isn't a liberal thing to do, but a Christian thing to do. Where within the history of fundamentalism, 20th century fundamentalism, and its descendants, do you think that sort of divide began to occur? Because even to me, even having studied these things in graduate school myself, like certain things they don't seem to have a direct, very clear, like, historical divide that suddenly charity became a liberal ideal and not a Christian ideal.
Right. Well, and that's the sort of thing that us historical theologians debate. Some people point to World War I as a kind of crisis moment where theologically the optimism of the 19th century died, and in exchange we got a real pessimism about human history. Some people will point to, oddly enough, and I think it's a compelling argument, that when prohibition was overturned, and I think I don't remember the year right now off the top of my head, but it was, I believe, in the late 20s. 29, yeah. That was a moment when many Christians sort of traded in their optimism about creating a perfect utopian Christian civilization, traded in that ideal and became more pessimistic. I think we can look at what Christians believe about the end times as a really good barometer for social action versus inward piety, because you have already in the preaching of someone like D.L. Moody in the very beginning of the 20th century, an attitude that this earth is just falling apart, that things are going to get worse before they get better. And so the theological terms for this are premillennialism or postmillennialism, but it's actually very simple. If you believe things are going to get really horrible and then Christ is going to suddenly break in and change it all, then you are a premillennialist. That most evangelicals, almost all evangelicals, subscribe to this idea. That's why you get so much rhetoric from the pulpit that, oh, our country's going to hell in a handbasket, and that sort of attitude. That was not the attitude of most 19th century evangelicals. They were very optimistic about the ability of humans, through their free will, motivated by the grace of God, to transform society into something better and beautiful. We have to be careful, because secular liberal optimism is different than Christian hope. And I'm not trying to be a spokesperson for secular liberal optimism that, oh, we're all basically good inside, and once we get society ordered straight, then everything will be peachy clean. No, that's not at all what I'm offering here. What I'm saying, and N.T. Wright articulates this really well in his book Surprised by Hope, that as Christians who believe in the resurrection, we have every reason to hold to a hope that we can here and now participate in the building of the kingdom of God, a grand construction project, so to speak. God doesn't need us, but that He does use us somehow mysteriously for the building of His kingdom. And that's a far different picture than let's all retreat into our conclaves. The world is going to all burn, and then we'll be zapped up into heaven someday. Really drastically different theologies there, and the implications are profound for how we behave in our society.
Absolutely. And in a similar N.T. Wright essay, there's an essay he wrote called "Jesus is Coming, Plant a Tree," and it gets to the point that you made about the end times belief, or the eschatology, to use the theological term there. That end times thinking, if you believe that the new creation, even that the story that's being told in Revelation, even N.T. Wright represents it as, and mentions the Greek that from the original text being, it's not, the new earth is not actually made out of, it's not something completely new. It's made out of the old earth. The just as in Romans, the all creation groans, and that Christians help redeem the physical universe. That very idea is completely dismissed, or at least pushed down very, very low within fundamentalist, modern fundamentalist evangelical thinking.
Absolutely right. Absolutely right. And it's not Christian. It's time to call it for what it is, that Christians have always, for millennia, believed in the resurrection of the body. And this is the drum that N.T. Wright keeps beating, and I hope that people will hear him. Evangelicals have adopted a very non-Christian understanding of the soul as some kind of ephemeral, ghost-like spirit, that will inhabit a heaven that is not of this earth. That's not Christian. The Christian hope is one of redemption of the present physical world that we currently inhabit, and of the descending of Jerusalem from the sky to be established here on earth. So you're absolutely right, and this is one area where conservative evangelicalism is almost treading on heretical ground, um, and yet because of lack of education of clergy or whatever the reason might be, many people don't even perceive that.
Mm-hmm. And to me, again, starting with the end times thinking and the thinking that the world is going poorly and getting worse, that sort of overall pessimism, that starts in the early 20th century. And given the historical context, they entered World War II. I'm sorry, they entered World War One, and then had the Great Depression, and then entered World War II. I mean, things were bad. And not to say that the rest of the 20th century was great, or that this century is great, but there was absolutely a reason. There were reasons to be pessimistic, but
Sure.
What I failed to connect personally, and perhaps you can help me and our listeners here connect, is how we get from that pessimism and the encroachment of these getting into historical theology. And let's not shy away from using the proper terms and everything. Getting into the historical theology of it, you have the entrance of premillennial dispensationalism that becomes the underlying standard for a whole couple generations of people across multiple denominations.
Right.
How do we get from that to what eventually becomes the most identifiable use of the word evangelical or evangelical, which is the political animal, being someone that's tied directly to Republican concerns, and not being completely unabashed about it. By the time I was in college, there was literally no presence of a college Democrats group, but there was a college Republicans group that was decades old.
Right.
Which made no sense. But how do we get from that place of having the beginnings of a number of different things, including this very influential dispensational premillennialism that is the theological thinking behind the Left Behind series and the late great Planet Earth and all these other apocalyptic visions? How do we get from there to the modern evangelical political movement? Is there a connection to be made? Because I want to draw it back to how we get from this divide that we have between 19th century socially progressive Christians. Yes,
evangelicals, even socially progressive.
We have abolitionists. We have people in the temperance movement, people in the women's suffrage, women's rights, all identifying as Christian, and even as evangelical. You have then for there to be this considerable 180 in the mid 20th century. What leads us to that moment?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I don't pretend to have the perfect answer to it, because books and books have been written on the subject. But you could really start to look at that, the formation of conservative politics, evangelicalism, forming an alliance, all the way back in 1920 with the Scopes Monkey trial, where William Jennings Bryan is kind of the spokesperson for people who want a Christian America, and versus the kind of secular liberal Chicagoan Clarence Darrow, who you know, doesn't take the Bible literally and believes in reason and science and all of these things. That's a good starting moment for looking at this, because once in the culture's mind, evangelicals become kind of backwards and anti-scientific. Evangelicals are kind of forced to retreat and to create their own subculture, their own bubble, and so you have the formation of colleges and institutions that are formed specifically for the purpose, Bible colleges especially, specifically for the purpose of creating and generating and reproducing this subculture over and against what is perceived to be an increasingly pagan nation. And so on down through the 20th century, you have this kind of theological development that sees the nation as post-Christian, and the need for Christians to the divine mission that's been given to Christians to try to save this country from going down the tubes. And so in come the 1970s, and some evangelicals were actually in favor of Jimmy Carter because of his own faith experience and his own evangelical roots. But when he goes through a really difficult presidency, lots of it which is outside of his hands, but is perceived mostly as weak and incapable, you have really a very brilliant political move on the part of leaders like Jerry Falwell to tap into this large theological group of people who are opposed to a lot of the progressive movements happening in the country, to say, let's join together and become a major voting bloc to oppose abortion, which was made legal by Roe v. Wade in '73, and get our man into office to re-Christianize this nation. And so that's when in 1980 you have Ronald Reagan elected, and then again in '84, and we see it also in Bush's Bush W's election and re-election. So it makes a kind of sense theologically that if you're really pessimistic about the ability of humans to produce good, and that some kind of divine intervention, cataclysm, is going to be necessary in order to save the world, then that kind of fits nicely with some of the Republican ideals of small government and government existing only to curb the sinfulness of human nature, that we can't trust large government because it is necessarily going to be corrupt. However, it goes both ways. The Republican Party's ideology, so to speak, influences evangelicals so that they conflate the two and aren't able to see the difference between Republican values and Christian values. And pretty soon they become one and the same. And so you have Christians who think that it is the Christian position to be pro-gun rights. It is the Christian position to be against illegal immigrants, because they become so conflated with one another in people's minds. And I think it's not until, there was always a remnant of Christians, Ron Sider and Tony Campolo and other evangelicals who were saying, wait a minute, back up the truck here. We are being corrupted by this alliance. There are those prophets, but the vast majority of evangelicals throughout this time period are utterly convinced that the Democrats are evil because they don't believe in God and these sorts of things. it's not a that's not a great answer, but it's just a kind of general sweeping stab at it. Randall Balmer has a great book called The Making of Evangelicalism. Um, and he argues that the rise of the religious right actually wasn't um, primarily focused on opposing abortion, which is a kind of noble cause, you might say, in the minds of evangelicals, but that Jerry Falwell and Liberty University actually consolidate this movement primarily because the government was forcing them to either integrate the school racially or not receive federal funding for their students. And this thoroughly angered Falwell, who didn't want to be told what to do by the federal government. And he starts the the moral majority, and this kind of right-wing coalition of evangelicals. It's really a fascinating alternate revisionist history that I highly recommend to our listeners for those who are interested in the history of the religious right.
Yeah. I haven't read that. I know that he did publish a much shorter version of it of that central thesis online, and I'll add that to the show notes. Where it was he does draw a very clear line between Brown v. Board of Education and all the ensuing case law related to that, and this darker side of evangelicalism, especially the evangelical colleges and their discriminatory practices, which is just incredibly unfortunate that is part of the history, but there's a lot of that within American history and American Christian history and Christian history. So it's
absolutely,
yeah,
we have to own that.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. So do you think the word evangelical has any merit outside of a political meaning now?
Mm-hmm. I go back and forth on this question of calling myself an evangelical or not, and it usually has to do with the context, in my opinion. Among academics who understand the historic meaning of evangelicalism, I don't mind calling myself an evangelical. Our listeners may be familiar with the kind of classic definition that David Bebbington, a church historian, offered for evangelicalism. People who are conversionist, who believe in the central authority of Scripture. There's a couple other criteria, who are crucicentric, that is, that something profound happened on the cross to save humanity. Oh, and also that they're evangelistic. They want to spread this faith. If that's the criteria, then I would say theologically I'm pretty close to being a conservative. I would quibble a little bit with views of Scripture and that sort of thing, but I'm close to it. However, there's also a cultural meaning of evangelical, which is primarily defined by the media, by current political discussions, and it very clearly means right-wing Republican. In fact, the average person on the street, I don't think, would even know that there are liberal evangelicals. That seems like an oxymoron. And so that's why I prefer to call myself merely a Christian, because I don't want to be identified with Jerry Falwell and with James Dobson and these Franklin Graham, these others who have promoted their particular vision of what the faith is politically, and in my opinion, made it into an idol. Plain and simple, they're guilty of creating an idol out of political power, and I don't want to have anything to do with that. So in most contexts, I do not call myself an evangelical for that reason.
And I think that's fair, given, there's a reason I gave this podcast the title it has, which is Exvangelical, and it's largely because of the cultural connotations of it, as well as the very fact that some people that remain Christians that come from this tradition are completely uncomfortable with it, whether it's because of the political conflation or because of some other theological reason, such as, there's so many to pick from. such as either traditional gender roles, views on marriage, all sorts of other things that that
Right.
this tradition has as part of its history. So I think that's absolutely fair to want to give a much simpler definition of yourself as a Christian instead of even any sort of denominational identity.
Sure.
So yeah, let's dive in. Let's move now to the current election cycle. Donald Trump has become the Republican nominee officially now. We're recording this a couple weeks removed from the Republican National Convention, where he secured the nomination. And during my first episode, we actually my guest then and I were kind of positing about evangelicals' response to this particular candidate, and we at one point we just kind of mused that there wouldn't be any endorsement of him. But now, a few weeks later, there have been polls that about 78% of evangelicals actually support Trump, and
It's incredible.
That has been a considerable thorn in many people's side. So where would you even want to start with kind of talking about why that particular endorsement is problematic?
Oh, Melanie, I mean, where do you start with Donald Trump, right? I think that this could actually be a turning point in our nation's history, in evangelical and Christian history, by Trump is exposing how the evangelical support of Donald Trump by 78%, according to that poll, is just exposing the degree to which evangelical Christians have sold their soul to something demonic. And the world sees it, the world will not forget, and it won't forgive. You have a candidate who is openly saying racist things, who doesn't condemn it when the leader of the KKK endorses him for a couple of days, until finally, under pressure, he says, "Okay, David Duke is not an endorsement I need." A man who bullies people, a man who is clearly a buffoon and a moron, but whom the Republicans, even those who don't want to, have had to get behind. And evangelicals are part of the reason that he's won. It's absolutely amazing. The reason that I say this could be a good thing is that maybe it will actually cause some soul searching among people on the religious right, who kind of, like the Iraq War woke me up to, how the disconnect between Republican politics and Christianity. I think that this moment of endorsement of Donald Trump, when you've got people like Franklin Graham saying he's a baby Christian and excusing him for all of his other stuff, and Trump himself in his acceptance speech kind of joking, by saying, "Thank you, evangelicals, for supporting me. I wouldn't be here without you. I'm not sure that I deserve it." And everybody kind of nervously laughs because they know it's true. Maybe this can be a wake-up moment. I want to be hopeful about that pastors and people alike across the country will say, "Whoa, how did we get here? How did we become associated with somebody who's xenophobic and racist and bigoted and a chauvinist? And how far can this be from the ethic of Jesus?" You really have a strong man, a Nietzschean strong man, whose theology is more Nietzschean than Christian, and yet many Christians are supporting him. Um, I see it as absurd. I think other people see it as absurd. And I hope that we will realize um, after the fact how bankrupt this alliance, this affair really is with the Republican Party. So, what's the alternative, right? I mean, I think I would like people to take a second look at two writers specifically who were very influential in my life. That's John Howard Yoder and Stanley Hauerwas, who are kind of articulating a new Anabaptist theology. Look, I realize a lot of evangelicals are very uncomfortable with Trump, but they're definitely not going to vote for Hillary Clinton because they're convinced that she's, if not just as bad, well, if not more evil than her, just as bad as Trump. But I want to say, can we just take a step back and try to be the church for a little bit? Try to be this alternative community, this polis, this political thing in the world that witnesses to an alternative kingdom that the world knows nothing of. And that's at the heart of Anabaptist theology. And I hope that there's a revival of thinking in an Anabaptist way, because we are seeing that politics as usual is leading us to some pretty dangerous compromises with Orthodox Christianity.
Yeah. So can you elucidate a little bit about what those two authors espouse that is the alternative? Just a little bit of what their individual teachings are in relation to political action in particular.
Right. So both Yoder and Hauerwas offer a theology that is very ecclesiocentric, meaning that the church plays a very important function in their understanding of the kingdom of God and of our role as Christians within Babylon. So think about this metaphor that the church is today in America, much like Israel was in exile in Babylon. That you had this community with a particular understanding of who God is, a book that outlines the rules and the laws of this God, and yet they are in exile and surrounded by a pagan culture that does not understand or speak the language of this tribe. I think it's a helpful metaphor for us to start thinking that way about the church today in America. The truth is, America has never been a Christian nation. So when you hear Christians say, we need to become a Christian nation again, they're begging the question. That's a false premise. However, you can say that there have been times in our history where a greater percentage of people were, quote unquote, pious Christians. And if people are pining for those days, we should embrace the fact that all of this whole idea is rooted in is rooted in the Constantinian union of church and state, which Yoder and Hauerwas write a lot about. That when Constantine, Emperor of Rome, was converted to Christianity in 313 and declared Rome to be a Christian empire, something fundamental shifted about Christianity at that point. That before it was a sect on the sidelines of society, Christians were oddballs who didn't fit in, and then after the priests become the politicians, and they get in bed with the government, and we see where it leads. It leads to crusades, and it leads to inquisitions, and it leads to Holy Roman empires, and it leads to slave trades. It leads to colonialism, and on and on and on the story goes. And Hauerwas and Yoder are reminding us that this whole union is in and of itself a bad thing, not because it's bad for the state. They don't give a care about the state and its health. They care about the church and the purity of the church and of its witness. And maybe we should say Good riddance to political power. It never served us well. We will be Christians in a foreign land, and even though we will work for the welfare of Babylon, planting gardens and trying to work for the flourishing of the city, we will always understand that our primary citizenship is in the church and our primary allegiance is Christ. It's for this reason that I don't say the Pledge of Allegiance to the American flag, and I've taught my daughters the same, because we don't want to have divided allegiances. You cannot serve both God and money. You cannot serve both Christ and Caesar. There are some fundamental incompatibilities with pledging your allegiance to both lords, and so that's why I recommend to people, let's rediscover the writings of Yoder. The Politics of Jesus, that one volume, is the most influential book on my own political theology of all, and it needs to have a revival in this day, in this era of Trump. The same for Howard Ross's Peaceable Kingdom and his many other writings. These guys have something to say to us in this moment, this particular moment in church history.
So these teachings and this way of thinking about politics is more about actually broadening it out from not just politics but to more social concerns. Is that fair to say? Like removing the more partisan aspects.
That's a very good way of putting it. Yeah,
I suppose that's removing the empire part of it a little bit, and maybe specializing it just a little bit to our historical moment here in the here and now in 2016. Feel free to elaborate and correct me on this, but it sounds like kind of what the alternative to the alternative of evangelicalism is broadening out the understanding of what it means to participate in an overall society, and not just within a political sphere as a Christian. Is that fair to say?
Right. When we say politics, we have something very particular in mind, but we should be very clear about, Francis Crick defines politics as I'm not going to quote him exactly, but the interchange between people in order to live peaceably and share life together. So politics involves friendship. It involves farmers markets and exchanges of services and goods. Politics is very encompassing term. It's how society is organized. And so if we understand it properly under that very wide umbrella, a Christian politics is one that puts human life first. It seeks first and foremost the flourishing of human life and of all of creation. If sin is breakdown of relationship between humans and God, humans and one another, humans and self, and humans and the earth, then a salvation and a proper theological politic is one that sees the reconciliation with God, with one another, with ourselves, and with the earth. And so what does this look like? It looks like the Reba Place community that we worship with on Sundays, where a group of 40, 50 some people actually share possessions in common and, have chickens in their backyard and try to eat locally. They try to live out the gospel in South Evanston among a violent part of the city by sharing peace and hope and by being good neighbors. This doesn't mean retreat from the political sphere. But it does involve a lot more action on the local level rather than trying to seize things from top down. It sees political action as something that should be organic and grassroots and populist rather than something that's bureaucratic and centralized. It's an exciting vision and understanding of the church that we can recapture in this day when so many people are saying, look, I don't want to have anything to do with this election. Neither candidate excites me. And, I'll speak for myself here. I'm not particularly energized by Hillary Clinton. Um, I want to instead think about how can I be a Christian, a witness to the peaceable kingdom of Christ in Evanston, where I live here and now. Um, that's a much more difficult question to answer than who should I vote for. Um, yeah, so that's what Hauerwas Yoder offered to us, I think, and it's a vision of the church that I think is pretty healthy. I don't agree with them on everything, but we need to hear their voice. One popularizer of this message right now is Russell Moore, who has a book out called Onward. And Russell Moore's deeply evangelical, very conservative in his theology. In fact, I don't even agree with all of his theology. He's so conservative. Yet he's actually popularizing the message of Yoder and Hauerwas to a crowd that otherwise wouldn't listen to them. He's saying, look, let's just realize this is not a Christian nation anymore. It never really was. It's time for the church to be the church and the world to be the world, and for us to know the difference between the two. I've recommended the book Onward to a number of conservative evangelicals because he speaks their language and challenges them to think differently about the relationship between church and state.
So, in an effort to try to wrap up your story, as well as some of the more general things that we've discussed in relation to the history of evangelicalism, the history of their connection to the political sphere, both on both sides of the partisan aisle. You have a more progressive or liberal history in the 19th century and a far more conservative expression of that in the 20th and 21st centuries. Given your background in exploring these ideas of political theology, how would you, in closing, really try to lift and this is something you address in your book, of trying to rise above the partisan aspect, the deeply partisan aspect of our current political climate, and try to address a more general concern about the state of the world and seeing that through a, let's just say Christian, let's not call it evangelical, just a Christian perspective.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the lines that you say is in your book is, peace without justice is not true peace. And I love that line. How do you see people that are Christian or were once Christian or are evangelical, however they might self-identify, how do you see them engaging in these issues in a way that's useful and not precisely partisan?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think the first thing is just simply believing that Jesus is Lord. Trump isn't Lord, Hillary isn't Lord, Obama isn't Lord. Let's not place our faith for humanity's future and for society's welfare in anything other than the ancient Christian affirmation that Jesus is Lord. And recognizing that every human party stands under the judgment of that Lord. And so we can't sign the dotted line saying, yes, I'm a Republican, or yes, I'm a Democrat, because that sacrifices our ability to critique those views by a different standard. Christians should always be political independents, I believe, because we always judge positions of political issues by a different standard, a standard that's external to the language that's being used by the media and to the bifurcation between the two parties of Republicans and Democrats. I believe when you boil it all down, if indeed God judges nations in the end, then he will judge them based upon how well they treated those on the margins. That is the ultimate litmus test. How did the nation treat those who are handicapped, physically or mentally? how did it treat those who are minorities ethnically, those who are economically disenfranchised and on the margins, those who are through sexual orientation or something else ostracized by the quote unquote normal people. If the life of Jesus and the witness of the Gospels tell us anything, it's that we will be judged according to how we have treated the least of these. And that means locally building relationships and friendships, living out the gospel organically in communities. Sure, I think it also means standing up for joining the movement of Black Lives Matter and objecting to when the 1% gets off scot-free after almost bringing our national economy to utter collapse. We can join those sorts of things when we think critically about each issue. I oppose abortion, even though it's not a Democrat or liberal thing. I'm still convinced that life begins at conception based upon my own theological understanding, and I would rather err on the side of treating that life as sacred. So our values are don't fall into nice, neat categories provided to us by the political system. We have to be able to stand above them because Christ stands above them and judges them.
It's a very good, thoughtful response. Thank you. Well, Greg, thank you so much for joining me in this conversation and sharing your story. I think a lot of people will be able to relate, and I do think a lot of people will have something to learn as well. I'll try to annotate our conversation with some references to some of the things we discussed in the show notes. Is there anywhere people can find you online, either on Twitter or a blog or anything that you'd like to point people towards?
Absolutely. First of all, I just want to say thanks so much, Blake, for having me be part of the Ex-Evangelical podcast. I'm really excited about what you're doing. I think it's going to tap into something very important and hopefully spark a lot of good thought and conversation. And I'm privileged to be part of it here at its beginning. People can check me out on Twitter at gregory.r.coates. And then I also have a blog that I very infrequently contribute to, but it's been writing on it for about 10 years now, and it's gregcoates.blogspot.com. It's a blog called an Untroubled Plants, which is a phrase from St. Teresa of Lisieux. It's kind of my musings on theology, politics, spirituality, and my own faith tradition.
Great. And
I hope people will check it out.
Also, what about plug your book? Don't forget that. So I picked it up on Amazon as a Kindle book, and it's a good read and it's a quick read. It took me maybe 3 or 4 hours over a couple of days. So,
right. Yeah, I wanted it to be kind of a bite-sized introduction to some of these issues through a focus historically on a couple of very important figures. But yeah, it's called Politics Strangely Warmed. It's published by Withenstock out of Eugene, Oregon. You can either get it at their website, Withenstock, or you can get it off of Amazon, Politics Strangely Warmed.
Great. Thanks very much again, Greg, for joining me.
Thank you, Blake. It's been my privilege.
I hope you enjoyed that conversation with Greg as much as I did. Now, I want to remind you again, if you haven't already, to go ahead and subscribe to Ex-Evangelical in the podcast app of your choice. Rate it, share it, review it. Also, follow us on Facebook at facebook.com/exevangelicalpod, and you can follow us on Twitter at exevangelicalpod. Thanks very much, and we'll talk to you next week.